March 15, 1959. Marcus Ice Williams walked into Bumpy Johnson's territory wearing a $300 suit and a smile that said he owned the world. 22 years old, Harvard-educated, connected to politicians Bumpy had never heard of. Ice had already taken over 3 of Bumpy's policy banks without firing a single shot. Now he was standing in Small's Paradise, Bumpy's own club, ordering the most expensive whiskey and telling everyone who'd listen that the old man's time was over. What Ice didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson was sitting in the shadows, watching, listening, calculating. And what happened in the next 72 hours would teach every young gangster in Harlem why experience beats education, why respect isn't inherited, and why challenging a king requires more than just confidence and connections. This is the story of how a cocky college boy tried to outsmart the smartest man in Harlem, and how Bumpy Johnson turned that boy's greatest strength into his greatest weakness. To understand what happened that night at Small's Paradise, you need to understand Harlem in 1959. The neighborhood was changing, fast. Young black men were coming back from Korea with military training and big ideas. College graduates were moving to New York with business degrees and no respect for the old ways. They looked at men like Bumpy Johnson and saw yesterday's news. Outdated gangsters who'd built their power through violence and intimidation when what the modern world required was sophistication, political connections, and legitimate business fronts. Marcus Ice Williams represented everything this new generation believed they could be. Born in Atlanta to a middle-class family, graduated from Harvard Business School at 20, moved to New York with letters of introduction to congressmen and bank presidents and union leaders. Ice understood that the future of organized crime wasn't about controlling corners and collecting from numbers runners. The future was about controlling politicians, manipulating legitimate businesses, using the legal system as a weapon while maintaining plausible deniability about criminal activities. Ice had proven his theories worked. In 6 months, he'd taken over gambling operations in 3 other cities without the old-style violence that attracted police attention and newspaper headlines. Ice's methods were surgical. He identified the key people in each organization, researched their backgrounds, found their weaknesses, and then applied pressure through legitimate channels. A gambling operator's son gets expelled from college for plagiarism. A policy bank owner suddenly faces IRS audits that reveal irregularities in tax payments. A numbers runner's wife gets fired from her job when her employer learns about her husband's criminal associations. Ice didn't threaten people. He just made it clear that cooperating with his organization would solve their problems while resisting would create new ones. It was brilliant, efficient, and completely legal. The old gangsters couldn't retaliate because Ice never actually committed crimes they could prove. They couldn't fight back because they didn't understand the weapons he was using. By March 1959, Ice had decided Harlem was ready for modernization, and Bumpy Johnson was the biggest obstacle to progress. Ice had studied Bumpy's organization for months. He understood that Bumpy's power came from personal loyalty, from being respected as someone who protected Harlem's community from outside threats, from being seen as more than just a criminal but as a neighborhood leader who happened to operate outside the law. But Ice also understood that personal loyalty was a weakness. It meant Bumpy had to maintain relationships with hundreds of people, had to be accessible, had to show up in public places where he could be observed and analyzed. Ice's plan was to isolate Bumpy from his community by demonstrating that the old man couldn't protect his people from modern threats. Ice would use legitimate pressure. ARA's investigations, building inspections, license revocations, employment problems, to make life difficult for anyone associated with Bumpy's organization. When people realized that Bumpy couldn't shield them from legal harassment, they'd start looking for alternatives, and Ice would be ready with solutions. The beauty of the plan was that it turned Bumpy's greatest strength against him. The more Bumpy tried to help his people through traditional means, threats, bribes, violence, the more problems Ice could create through official channels. Every time Bumpy fought back using old methods, he'd prove that he was a relic who couldn't protect his community in the modern world. Ice had already begun implementing this strategy. 3 of Bumpy's policy banks had been shut down by police raids that Ice had arranged through his political connections. Two of Bumpy's collectors had been arrested for tax evasion based on information ICE had provided to federal investigators. A restaurant that Bumpy used for meetings had been closed by health inspectors after ICE had documented violations and filed anonymous complaints. But taking down the policy banks wasn't enough. ICE needed to humiliate Bumpy publicly, needed to demonstrate that the king of Harlem was powerless against modern enemies who understood how to use the system as a weapon. That's why ICE walked into Small's Paradise on the night of March 15, 1959. Small's Paradise was Bumpy's unofficial headquarters, the place where he held court every Friday night, where people came to pay respects and ask favors, where Bumpy's presence reminded everyone that despite changing times and modern challenges, there was still one man who controlled Harlem's streets. For ICE to challenge Bumpy in Small's Paradise was the equivalent of walking into a king's throne room and announcing that the monarchy was over. ICE arrived at 9:30 p.m. Deliberately late enough that the club would be crowded, that there would be maximum witnesses to whatever happened next. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit with a gray silk tie, Italian leather shoes, and a gold watch that cost more than most people in Harlem earned in a year. He looked like money, like success, like the future walking into a room full of the past. Bumpy was at his usual corner table with 4 associates, older men who'd been with him for decades. Men who'd survived the Dutch Schultz Wars and the Lucky Luciano negotiations, and the police raids that had defined Harlem's criminal history for the past 25 years. They were playing cards and talking quietly while keeping one eye on the crowd, monitoring who was coming and going, identifying potential problems before they developed. ICE walked directly to the bar, ordered a glass of Hennessy XO, the most expensive cognac Small's Paradise served, and began talking to anyone who would listen. Not quietly, not discreetly, but loud enough that his voice carried across the club, loud enough that everyone including Bumpy could hear every word. "Times are changing in Harlem," ICE announced, raising his glass to the bartender and to the people gathered around the bar. "The old ways of doing business, the violence and intimidation that worked in the 1930s and 1940s, that doesn't work anymore. Modern law enforcement is too sophisticated. Political connections are too important. You need education and legitimate fronts and understanding of how the real world operates outside of street corners." He took a sip of cognac and continued, his voice getting louder, his confidence building, as he realized people were listening. What worked for the previous generation, running numbers and threatening people and thinking you could solve everything with guns, that's finished. The future belongs to people who understand business, who have political connections, who can work within the system instead of just fighting against it. The club got quieter as people realized what was happening, as they understood that this well-dressed young man was publicly criticizing Bumpy Johnson's methods while standing in Bumpy Johnson's own establishment. Some customers looked toward Bumpy's table, waiting to see how the old man would react to being disrespected so blatantly. Others looked toward the exits, recognizing that they might want to leave before this confrontation escalated into something dangerous. But Bumpy didn't react. He continued playing cards, continued talking quietly with his associates, gave no indication that he'd even noticed ICE's presence or ICE's words. This lack of response seemed to embolden ICE, who apparently interpreted Bumpy's silence as weakness or uncertainty. "Take the policy business," ICE continued, now speaking directly to the crowd that had gathered around him. "The old operators think they can just collect money and pay off beat cops and threaten anyone who causes trouble. But federal investigators don't care about local protection. IRS agents can't be intimidated by street reputation. Modern criminals need legitimate business fronts, need accountants and lawyers, need political connections at the federal level." ICE finished his cognac and ordered another, his movements confident, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed he was explaining obvious truths to people who'd been too ignorant to understand them. "The future of organized crime in Harlem belongs to professionals, not to old men who think reputation and violence can solve modern problems." That's when Bumpy Johnson stood up. The movement was so quiet, so controlled, that most people in the club didn't notice immediately. Bumpy simply rose from his chair, said something to his associates that made them nod, and began walking across the crowded floor toward where Ice stood at the bar. Bumpy was 54 years old in 1959, not a large man physically, but his presence filled rooms in ways that had nothing to do with size. As he moved through the crowd, conversations stopped. People stepped aside without being asked. The jazz band continued playing, but everything else in Small's Paradise paused to watch what would happen next. Ice didn't notice Bumpy approaching until the old man was standing directly behind him. Close enough to touch, close enough that Ice could feel someone's presence without seeing who it was. Ice turned around, found himself looking into Bumpy Johnson's eyes, and for the first time that evening, his confidence wavered. Bumpy didn't say anything initially. He just looked at Ice with the kind of calm, measuring expression that suggested he was evaluating something, calculating possibilities, making decisions that Ice couldn't understand or anticipate. The silence stretched for several seconds, while everyone in Small's Paradise waited to see whether this confrontation would end with words or violence. Finally, Bumpy spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, so soft that people nearby had to strain to hear him, but carrying an undertone that made everyone understand they were witnessing something significant. "You must be Marcus Williams," Bumpy said. "Ice, right? That's what they call you. I've been hearing interesting things about your business methods. Very modern, very sophisticated, using government agencies to solve problems instead of handling things directly." Ice straightened his shoulders, trying to recover his earlier confidence. "Mr. Johnson, I was hoping we'd have a chance to meet. I think there are opportunities for cooperation between your organization and mine, ways we could work together that would benefit both of us." Bumpy nodded slowly, as if considering the proposition. "Cooperation, that's an interesting word. What kind of cooperation did you have in mind when you were cooperating with the police to shut down my policy banks? What kind of mutual benefit were you thinking about when you were cooperating with federal investigators to have my collectors arrested?" Ice's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "Business is competitive, Mr. Johnson. I'm sure you understand that. Sometimes market forces require adjustments to existing arrangements. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," Bumpy repeated, tasting the words like they had a flavor he found interesting. "Market forces. Adjustments to existing arrangements. You talk like a businessman. Ice. That's what they taught you at Harvard, right? How to turn human relationships into abstract concepts. How to describe destroying people's lives as market adjustments." The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the club that Bumpy Johnson was having a conversation with the young man who'd been publicly challenging his authority. People pressed closer, trying to hear everything, understanding they were witnessing either the beginning of a war or the end of Ice's career in Harlem. "The problem with your education, Ice," Bumpy continued, his voice still quiet but carrying throughout the now silent club, "is that it taught you how to manipulate systems, but it didn't teach you how to understand people. You think you can destroy my organization by applying pressure through official channels, by making life difficult for people who work with me, but you don't understand why those people work with me in the first place." Bumpy stepped closer to Ice, close enough that their conversation became even more intimate, more personal. "You think loyalty can be purchased, or that it dissolves when things get difficult. You think respect is something you earn through education and connections rather than through actions over decades. You think power comes from knowing the right people instead of from being the right person." Ice tried to respond, but Bumpy wasn't finished. "Here's what you don't understand about Harlem, Ice. This isn't just business territory. It's home. These aren't just customers and employees. They're family. And family doesn't abandon each other when outside forces create problems. Family fights back." Bumpy's voice dropped even lower, becoming almost a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting could have conveyed. "You've spent months studying my organization, learning about my methods, identifying what you think are my weaknesses. But you made one mistake, Ice. You studied me like I was a business problem instead of understanding that I'm a man who's been fighting for this community for 30 years. And now you're going to learn why that was a mistake." Ice finally found his voice. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "I don't make threats, Ice. I make promises. And here's my promise. You've got 72 hours to undo every problem you've created for my people. Every investigation you initiated gets dropped. Every business you've damaged gets restored. Every person you've hurt through your modern methods gets compensated." He paused, letting the terms sink in. "And if those problems aren't solved in 72 hours, you're going to discover that old-fashioned methods work just fine in the modern world. The only question is whether you're smart enough to avoid finding out personally." Ice looked around the club, seeking support, or at least neutral faces among the crowd, but found only expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. He was alone in a room full of people who'd known Bumpy Johnson for decades, who'd seen him protect their community through wars and raids and economic hardships, who had personal loyalty to a man they viewed as more than just a criminal boss. 72 hours, Ice said, trying to maintain some dignity and retreat. "I'll consider your proposition." "You do that," Bumpy said. "Consider it carefully." Ice walked out of Small's paradise with as much composure as he could manage, but everyone in the club understood that he'd been publicly backed down by an older man who hadn't raised his voice or made any explicit threat, who'd simply made it clear that Ice's modern methods weren't going to work in Harlem against someone who commanded genuine loyalty from his community. But what Ice didn't know, what nobody in Small's paradise knew that night, was that Bumpy Johnson had no intention of waiting 72 hours to respond to Ice's challenge. The conversation at the bar had been theater, designed to establish the public record that Bumpy had tried to resolve the situation diplomatically before resorting to other methods. The real response had already been planned and would begin within hours. Bumpy had spent weeks studying Ice, just as carefully as Ice had studied him. While Ice was researching Bumpy's organization through official records and political connections, Bumpy was investigating Ice through street sources, learning details about the young man's background that weren't available in any government database or university file. Bumpy knew that Ice's Harvard education had been financed by scholarship money that technically belonged to other students, money that had been diverted through a complex scheme involving falsified recommendation letters and fabricated financial need documentation. Bumpy knew that Ice's political connections in Atlanta included a city councilman who was being blackmailed about gambling debts and a union leader who was stealing from pension funds. Bumpy knew that Ice's sophisticated business fronts were actually elaborate money laundering operations that would collapse under scrutiny from investigators who understood what to look for. Most importantly, Bumpy knew that Ice's greatest weakness was his need to be perceived as legitimate, as someone who operated through legal channels and maintained plausible deniability about criminal activities. Ice's entire approach depended on maintaining the fiction that he was a legitimate businessman who happened to compete effectively against criminal organizations. If that fiction was destroyed, if Ice was exposed as just another criminal who was better at hiding his crimes, then his political connections would evaporate and his sophisticated methods would become useless. Bumpy's plan was to use Ice's strength against him, just as Ice had tried to do to Bumpy. But Bumpy's approach was more direct, more personal, and more devastating. At 3:15 a.m., approximately 6 hours after the confrontation at Small's Paradise, Ice Williams was awakened in his expensive apartment on the Upper East Side by someone knocking on his door. Not pounding or banging, just a calm, persistent knocking that continued until Ice put on a robe and went to see who was visiting at such an unusual hour. Through the peephole, Ice saw a well-dressed black woman who appeared to be in her 40s, someone he didn't recognize but who looked harmless enough that he opened the door with the chain still attached. "Mr. Williams, my name is Sarah Henderson. I work for the Amsterdam News. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but I have some questions about your business operations that I was hoping you could help me understand before we publish a story about your activities in Harlem." The Amsterdam News was Harlem's most influential newspaper, the publication that shaped public opinion in the black community, the source where Harlem residents learned about local politics and business and community developments. If the Amsterdam News was preparing a story about Ice's operations, particularly a story that required late-night interviews and couldn't wait for normal business hours, then Ice was facing exactly the kind of public exposure that could destroy his carefully maintained image as a legitimate businessman. Ice unhooked the chain and opened the door fully. "What kind of questions?" Sarah Henderson entered the apartment, pulled out a small notebook, and began asking questions that made Ice's blood pressure spike with each inquiry. We've received information suggesting that your educational background includes some irregularities in how your Harvard scholarship was obtained. Specifically, we have documentation showing that recommendation letters from Atlanta community leaders were fabricated and that financial need statements contained false information about your family's income. She flipped to another page in her notebook. We also have information about your business relationships in Atlanta, including evidence that you've been blackmailing city officials and stealing from union pension funds. Our sources suggest these activities continued after you moved to New York and began operating in Harlem. Ice tried to interrupt, but Sarah continued relentlessly. Most concerning, we have detailed records of how you've been manipulating federal investigations to target legitimate Harlem businesses, how you've been using your political connections to shut down community organizations that compete with your operations, and how your entire business model is based on using government agencies as weapons against people who can't fight back through official channels. She looked up from her notebook and made direct eye contact with Ice. The story publishes in tomorrow's edition, unless you'd like to provide responses to these allegations, or perhaps explain why our readers shouldn't conclude that you're a sophisticated criminal who's been exploiting legitimate institutions to destroy community businesses. Ice sat down heavily in his living room chair, understanding that his worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Public exposure of his criminal activities would end his political connections instantly. No congressman or bank president would continue associating with someone who'd been revealed as a fraud and a criminal. His sophisticated business fronts would collapse under investigation. His entire approach to criminal enterprise would become useless. "What do you want?" Ice asked quietly. "I want the truth," Sarah said. "But more specifically, I want you to explain to our readers why someone with your education and opportunities chose to harm Harlem's community instead of helping it. Why you decided to use your advantages to destroy local businesses instead of building them up." Ice looked at her carefully, recognizing that this wasn't really an interview. This was a message from Bumpy Johnson, delivered through a journalist who was either working with Bumpy or who had been provided with information that Bumpy wanted published. The questions were too specific, the timing too convenient, the knowledge too detailed for this to be coincidental. "If I answered your questions," Ice said slowly, "if I provided information that helped your readers understand my perspective, would that affect when the story publishes?" Sarah smiled. "That would depend on what kind of information you provided and how helpful it was in helping our community understand what's been happening to local businesses recently." They talked for another hour. Ice, recognizing he had no choice, began explaining his methods, his motivations, his plans for modernizing Harlem's criminal enterprises. As he talked, he realized he was essentially confessing to a reporter, providing detailed descriptions of criminal activities that would destroy him if published, but hoping that cooperation might somehow reduce the damage. Sarah took notes carefully, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she already knew most of what Ice was telling her, and finally closed her notebook with an expression that suggested she'd gotten everything she needed. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Williams. I think our readers will find this very informative." After Sarah left, Ice sat in his apartment, trying to understand what had just happened and what he could do to minimize the damage. He could leave New York immediately, abandon his Harlem operations, and start over somewhere else. But running would confirm everything the Amsterdam News planned to publish and would end any possibility of maintaining legitimate business fronts in the future. He could try to use his political connections to suppress the story, but that would require explaining his criminal activities to people who'd already be looking for excuses to distance themselves from him. Or he could try to negotiate with Bumpy Johnson directly, hoping to reach some arrangement that would prevent the story from publishing. At 9 a.m., Ice called the number he'd been given for reaching Bumpy Johnson's organization. The person who answered told him that Mr. Johnson would be available for a meeting at 2 p.m. at a location in Harlem that Ice would be given later. The tone was polite but not friendly. The tone of someone arranging a business meeting that both parties understood was actually surrender negotiations. Ice spent the morning trying to think of alternatives, trying to find some way to salvage his position without completely capitulating to Bumpy's demands. But every option he considered led to the same conclusion. Bumpy held all the advantages now. The information Bumpy had gathered could destroy ICE's legitimate fronts and political connections. The community support Bumpy commanded meant ICE would have no local allies. And ICE's own methods, using official channels and legal pressure to solve problems, couldn't be used against someone like Bumpy who operated outside those systems and who had survived decades of law enforcement attention. At 2 p.m., ICE arrived at the designated meeting location, a small restaurant on Lenox Avenue that appeared to cater primarily to local residents rather than tourists or outsiders. Bumpy was waiting at a corner table, alone, reading a newspaper while drinking coffee. He looked up when ICE entered, nodded toward an empty chair, and continued reading for another minute before acknowledging ICE's presence. "I assume you've had a chance to think about our conversation last night," Bumpy said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "And I assume you've had a chance to speak with Sarah Henderson about her upcoming story." ICE nodded. "I understand that you have information that could cause problems for my business operations." "Information," Bumpy repeated. "That's one way to describe it. Another way would be evidence of criminal activities that your political friends wouldn't want to be associated with." Bumpy leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming more direct. "Here's what's going to happen. ICE, you're going to undo every problem you've created for my people. Every investigation gets dropped. Every business gets restored. Every person gets compensated. You're going to use your political connections and your sophisticated methods to solve the problems you created, and you're going to do it publicly enough that everyone in Harlem understands you're making things right." ICE started to respond, but Bumpy continued. "And then you're going to leave Harlem. Not just close your operations, but actually leave. Go back to Atlanta. Go to Chicago. Go anywhere that isn't my neighborhood. Because if you stay, you'll be tempted to try again. And next time I won't be as patient about explaining why that's a mistake." ICE looked around the restaurant, noticing that other customers were watching their conversation with obvious interest. Understanding that this meeting was as public as the confrontation at Small's Paradise had been, that word of his surrender would spread throughout Harlem as quickly as word of his initial challenge had spread. "And if I refuse?" Bumpy picked up the newspaper he'd been reading and showed ICE the front page. The headline read, "Harvard-educated con man targets Harlem businesses." Below that was a large photograph of ICE in his expensive suit, taken outside Small's Paradise the previous night. "The story publishes in tomorrow's edition," Bumpy said quietly. "Unless, of course, there's no longer a reason to publish it because the problems it describes have been solved." ICE read the first few paragraphs of the article, seeing his own words from the early morning interview with Sarah Henderson, seeing detailed descriptions of his criminal activities in Atlanta, seeing evidence that would destroy his political connections and legitimate business fronts. The story portrayed him not as a sophisticated modern criminal, but as a fraud who preyed on community organizations while pretending to be a legitimate businessman. "You've got 48 hours, Bumpy said, standing up from the table. "After that, the story publishes whether or not you've made things right, because at that point it becomes a matter of letting the community know what kind of person you really are." ICE remained seated as Bumpy walked out of the restaurant, leaving him alone with a newspaper that contained enough information to end his career and enough time to salvage something, if he acted quickly and completely. Over the next 48 hours, ICE Williams used every political connection and every sophisticated method he'd developed to undo the damage he'd inflicted on Bumpy Johnson's organization. IRS investigations were quietly dropped due to lack of evidence. Police raids were canceled due to procedural concerns. Business licenses that had been revoked were mysteriously restored. People who'd been arrested on ICE's information were released when prosecutors decided the cases weren't worth pursuing. ICE worked around the clock, calling in every favor, spending his own money to compensate people who'd lost income due to his actions, using his legitimate business fronts to provide employment for people who'd been fired due to his pressure campaigns. He did everything publicly, making sure that everyone in Harlem understood that the young Harvard graduate who challenged Bumpy Johnson was now working desperately to undo that challenge. On the morning of March 18th, 47 hours after his meeting with Bumpy Ice Williams loaded his belongings into a rented truck and drove out of New York City. He left behind an expensive apartment, abandoned profitable business operations, and forfeited any claim to territory or respect in Harlem's criminal underworld. The Amsterdam News never published the story about his criminal activities. There was no longer any reason to publish it, since the problems the story would have described had been solved. But word of Ice's complete surrender spread throughout Harlem's community faster than any newspaper story could have spread, becoming a legend that would be told for decades about the young man who thought he could outthink Bumpy Johnson. What made the story legendary wasn't just that Ice had been defeated, but how he'd been defeated. Bumpy hadn't used violence or traditional criminal methods. Instead, he'd used Ice's own sophistication against him, had applied pressure through channels that Ice understood but couldn't control, had demonstrated that modern methods worked both ways, and that experience still mattered more than education when it came to understanding how power actually functioned. The lesson wasn't lost on other young criminals who might have been tempted to challenge established leaders through modern techniques. If someone as smart as Ice Williams, someone with Harvard education and political connections and sophisticated business fronts, could be completely outmaneuvered by an older man using traditional street intelligence, then challenging Bumpy Johnson required more than just confidence and contemporary methods. But the story also revealed something important about Bumpy himself. At age 54, when many criminals were either dead or in prison, when changing times seemed to be making older gangsters obsolete, Bumpy had proven that adaptability was more important than age, that understanding people was more valuable than understanding systems, and that real power came from community support rather than from political connections. Ice Williams never returned to New York. He eventually established operations in Detroit where his modern methods proved more successful against criminals who lacked Bumpy's community support and street intelligence. But people who knew him said he never again made the mistake of underestimating older opponents or assuming that education could substitute for experience in conflicts that mattered. Bumpy Johnson continued controlling Harlem's criminal underworld for another 9 years until his death in 1968. During that time, other young criminals occasionally challenged his authority, but none with the sophistication or confidence that Ice Williams had brought to the conflict. The story of how Bumpy had defeated Harvard-educated competition became part of Harlem legend, a reminder that respect couldn't be purchased or inherited, that wisdom came from experience rather than from books, and that challenging a king required more than just modern methods and youthful ambition. The confrontation between Bumpy Johnson and Marcus Ice Williams in March 1959 represented more than just a territorial dispute between criminals. It was a collision between two different approaches to power, two different understandings of how authority functioned in African American communities, and two different visions of what criminal leadership should look like in the modern era. Ice represented the future, as many young Black Americans imagined it in 1959. Education, political connections, legitimate business fronts, and sophisticated understanding of how systems worked. His approach suggested that criminal organizations could evolve into something more respectable, more sustainable, more connected to mainstream American success. Bumpy represented continuity. The idea that some principles didn't change regardless of how much society evolved around them. Community loyalty, personal honor, direct accountability, and the understanding that real power came from being trusted by people who knew you personally rather than from manipulating systems that operated impersonally. The confrontation proved that both approaches had strengths and weaknesses, but that in Harlem, in 1959, community trust still mattered more than institutional connections, personal relationships still carried more weight than abstract methods, and experience still trumped education when it came to understanding how people actually behaved under pressure. Ice's defeat didn't mean that modern methods were useless or that traditional approaches would always prevail. It meant that successful criminal leadership required understanding both approaches, knowing when to use sophisticated techniques and when to rely on street wisdom, being able to adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning the fundamental principles that created genuine loyalty. Bumpy's victory wasn't just about defeating a young challenger. It was about proving that age and experience remained valuable in a rapidly changing world, that community leadership couldn't be replaced by institutional manipulation, and that real respect had to be earned through actions over time, rather than acquired through connections or credentials. The story became part of Harlem folklore, not because it was particularly violent or dramatic, but because it illustrated timeless lessons about power, respect, and community that remained relevant long after the specific circumstances that created the conflict had passed. Young people learned that confidence without wisdom was dangerous, that challenging established leaders required more than just modern methods, and that understanding systems was less important than understanding people. Older residents learned that adaptation didn't require abandoning principles, that experience remained valuable even in changing times, and that community support was still the most reliable foundation for lasting power. And everyone learned that the collision between old and new, between tradition and innovation, between street wisdom and institutional sophistication, didn't have to result in destruction if it was managed by people who understood that both approaches had value and could potentially complement each other, rather than necessarily destroying each other. Marcus "Ice" Williams left Harlem defeated, but not destroyed. His methods had been proven insufficient for the challenge he'd chosen, but the methods themselves weren't inherently wrong. Applied in different circumstances against different opponents with different community relationships, Ice's sophisticated approach might have succeeded. Bumpy Johnson remained in control of Harlem's underworld, but the challenge from Ice had forced him to demonstrate that his traditional methods could adapt to modern threats, that his understanding of people and community could counter sophisticated institutional pressure, and that his age and experience remained assets rather than liabilities in conflicts with younger, more educated opponents. The real victory wasn't Bumpy's defeat of Ice, but the demonstration that different approaches to criminal leadership could be evaluated and compared through actual conflict, that communities could judge for themselves which methods better served their interests, and that respect and power ultimately belonged to whoever could most effectively protect and serve the people who mattered. If this story of generational conflict, community loyalty, and the collision between old-school wisdom and new-school sophistication moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that respect isn't given based on education or connections, but earned through actions over time. And let me know in the comments, do you think Ice Williams could have succeeded with different tactics, or was he doomed from the start by underestimating what real community leadership requires? Remember, in Harlem in 1959, as in every time and place where real power is at stake, it's not enough to be smart or sophisticated or well-connected. You have to understand people, you have to earn trust, and you have to prove that when it matters most, you'll choose your community over your personal advancement. That's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was when Marcus "Ice" Williams learned it the hard way from Bumpy Johnson.